The car her father gave her to drive to high school had a dead woman's body in the trunk. His name was Dennis Rader. Her name is Kerri Rawson. And for the first 26 years of her life, she knew him as one thing and one thing only: Dad. He coached her through scraped knees and broken elbows. He drove her to the emergency room without hesitating. He hiked with her through the Grand Canyon. He cried when she left for college. In 2003, he walked her down the aisle. He was also president of his church congregation, a Cub Scout leader, a compliance officer for the city of Park City, Kansas, the kind of man who cited neighbors for tall grass and too long driveways, the kind of man who was known as thorough, reliable, present, the kind of man Wichita, Kansas trusted completely. There were things Kerri would later realize she had always noticed, things she had felt but never let herself name. Dennis Rader was the kind of father who showed up. That's the version of him Kerri carried for most of her life, and it wasn't wrong, exactly. It was just incomplete in a way she couldn't have imagined. He was organized, meticulous. He kept detailed records of everything. He loved the outdoors, taught his kids to hike, to notice things. His daughter would later describe her childhood as loving. She wasn't performing gratitude, she meant it. At Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, he served as president of the congregation. Not just a member, the president. The man people called when there was a conflict to resolve or a decision to make. He was reliable. He was present. At his day job, he enforced municipal code compliance. He cited people for property violations, tracked violations, followed up. He was, by every external measure, a man who believed in order. And as a father, he was there. The hospital when she broke her elbow. The college drop-off where he got emotional. The wedding in 2003 where he walked her toward a future he would not be part of for much longer. This is the version of Dennis Rader that Kerri Rawson carried for the first 26 years of her life. Here is what she didn't know she was carrying alongside it. Kerri was 6 years old when her neighbor Maureen Hedge was murdered. The woman lived on the same street, same quiet Park City block where Kerri played, where she rode her bike, where she knew which driveways were safe and which dogs to avoid. Hedge disappeared from that street in 1985. Around that same time, Kerri started having night terrors. She couldn't explain them. There was no vocabulary for what her body seemed to understand before her mind could catch up. She just woke up afraid of something she couldn't name. She never named it. Not then. In January of 1974, Dennis Rader murdered 4 members of the Otero family in their home in Wichita, Kansas. Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, their son Joey, age 11, their daughter Josephine, age 13. He was 29 years old. Kerri wasn't born yet. He named himself. He called it BTK, bind, torture, kill, and he sent letters to the police and media explaining himself in careful detail. He wanted recognition. He wanted Wichita to know what he was doing and understand that he was doing it deliberately. He killed Catherine Bright that same year. Then Shirley Vian and Nancy Fox in 1977. Then Maureen Hedge in 1985. His neighbor, Kerri's neighbor, the woman who lived on the same street where a 6-year-old girl was starting to wake up in the night from dreams she couldn't describe. Then Vicki Wedrell in 1986, and Dolores Davis in 1991. 10 victims, 17 years. And then silence. For over a decade, BTK said nothing, sent nothing. The letters stopped. The taunting stopped. Wichita eventually began to assume what people assume when the worst thing in their city disappears without explanation, that he must have died. He hadn't. He was coaching Cub Scouts. He was attending church. He was citing neighbors for grass that had grown too tall. Here is what investigators didn't know yet, what they were still missing when the silence stretched into years, then into decades. The DNA that would eventually catch him already existed. It was out there. They just didn't know where to find it. They would. 2004. After more than a decade without contact, BTK returned. New letters arrived, then a package, then finally a floppy disk sent to KSASTV in Wichita. Inside the disk were documents. Inside the documents was metadata. And in that metadata, buried in the file properties in plain text, was the name of the computer the files had been created on, and the name of the organization that owned it. Christ Lutheran Church. 30 years of evading detection. 30 years of taunting investigators, committing murders, living a double life so complete that an entire city believed he was dead. And he was caught because of a floppy disk. Investigators moved quietly. They identified Dennis Rader as the primary suspect, but they needed to confirm the DNA match before making a move. The problem: they needed a biological relative. Here is how they solved it. Kerri Rawson had received medical care at Kansas State University. Her records were on file. Investigators obtained a DNA sample from those records, without telling her, without contacting her, without giving her any indication that the quiet life she was living in Michigan was about to change permanently. The sample matched. Every murder, every letter, every name. Her father. February 25, 2005. Dennis Rader was pulled over on his lunch break, arrested without incident. The man who had killed 10 people over 17 years offered no resistance. The same day, an FBI agent drove to a home in Michigan and knocked on a door. Kerri Rawson opened it. She was newly married. She was expecting her first child. She was living in Michigan, far from Wichita, far from Park City, far from the street where she had grown up riding her bike and knowing which neighbors were safe. She called her parents regularly. She had no reason for alarm. Then the FBI agent at the door told her who her father was. What the next hours felt like, the calls she had to make, the things she had to hear confirmed, the process of understanding that the man who had cried at her college drop-off and walked her down the aisle 2 years earlier had been living this parallel existence since before she was born. She has described it in her own words, in her own book, and the description is not something that benefits from being compressed into a documentary narration. It was what it was. Devastation in stages, over a very long time. But one detail is worth returning to. The car. The one he gave her to drive to high school. The one she had borrowed and driven and taken for granted the way teenagers take cars for granted, as transportation, as freedom, as the thing that gets you from here to there. In 1991, Dennis Rader murdered Dolores Davis. She was his final known victim. He transported her body in the trunk of that car, the same car, before giving it to his daughter. Kerri learned this after the arrest. She had driven that car to school. There was something else she would later find, something that had been sitting in her father's handwriting for years. Investigators knew about it. When they told her, they also told her not to bring it up directly. Not yet. 3 people lived with Dennis Rader and survived him in different ways. Paula Rader was granted an emergency divorce within days of the arrest, one of the fastest divorces in Kansas court history. A judge approved it almost immediately without delay because the situation warranted it. She moved out of Kansas. She has not made a public statement. She has not given interviews. She has lived privately entirely since February 2005, and she has asked for nothing else. Brian Rader, Kerri's older brother, suffered physical violence from his father as a child. He became an Eagle Scout. He served in the United States Navy. He has never spoken publicly about his father, not once. Not to media, not in a documentary, not in an interview of any kind. That silence has lasted 20 years, and it deserves to be acknowledged as the choice it is, without editorializing. And then there is Kerri, the one who stayed in public, the one who wrote the memoir, A Serial Killer's Daughter, published in 2019, the one who continued doing advocacy work for crime victims' families, the one who got divorced, who struggled through serious health issues including long COVID, who launched a GoFundMe in 2025 for housing and medical expenses while still showing up to speak on behalf of people navigating what she had navigated. She didn't choose this. She has said this clearly. She did not choose to be Dennis Rader's daughter. She did not choose to have her DNA used by investigators without her knowledge. She did not choose to open the door on February 25th. She chose what came after. She is still choosing it. In 2023, investigators came to Kerri Rawson with a request. They needed her to go into a room with her father. There were unsolved murders in Osage County, Kansas, cases that had gone cold, cases that might be connected to Dennis Rader, cases that investigators believed he might be willing to discuss if the right person was in the room with him. They believed that person was his daughter. They asked her to try. Before she went, she had something she needed to process. She had found one of her father's notebooks, written in the 1980s in his own hand. He had written about a bondage fantasy involving a bathtub. He had written it in detail, the way he wrote everything, methodical, thorough, recorded. Her name was in it. Investigators told her not to raise it during the prison visit. They were afraid that if she confronted him directly, he would shut down, that whatever information he might be willing to provide about Osage County would close off the moment he felt cornered. They needed him cooperative. They needed her to hold it. She held it. She walked into El Dorado Correctional Facility, sat across from her father, and tried to do what investigators needed from her. What she saw in that room she has described publicly, and it is this: he switched. Between visits, between questions, between one moment and the next, when she asked him ordinary things, the kinds of things you ask a father, a person you once knew, he was warm, familiar, recognizable. He was her dad, the man from the hiking trips and the hospital visits and the wedding aisle. When she asked questions, he didn't like questions that got close to the territory investigators were interested in. The warmth disappeared. What replaced it wasn't cold exactly. It was something else, something that didn't have the texture of a person she had ever known. She watched him switch between those two states across the course of a single visit. She came out of the prison shaking. After she walked out, Kerri Rawson made a decision about her father that she has not reversed. She cut all contact. No letters, no visits, no calls. She has referred to him since publicly in interviews without hesitation as subhuman, not in rage, not as a provocation, in the tone of someone who has finished a long process of arriving at a conclusion and chosen to stay there. Dennis Rader is 80 years old. He is in El Dorado Correctional Facility, serving 10 consecutive life sentences. He still, until prison officials intervened, sent personal items, underwear, glasses, to admirers who wrote to him. He still has people who write to him, still exists as a figure some people find fascinating in a way that has nothing to do with the 10 people he murdered or the families that survived them. He exists as Kerri Rawson's father in every biological and legal sense. She does not write back. In October 2025, Netflix released My Father, the BTK Killer, a documentary in which Kerri Rawson chose to tell her story again, on camera in full for the largest possible audience. She has connected with the daughter of Rex Heuermann, the suspect in the Gilgo Beach murders on Long Island. Two women from entirely different contexts, navigating the same specific kind of confusion. What it means to love a father who turned out to be something that language struggles to contain. She has noted publicly that she believes her father may have been in contact with Bryan Kohberger, the suspect in the University of Idaho murders in 2022. She has described similarities between the two: the academic interest in criminology, the methodical precision, the apparent normalcy maintained alongside alleged violence. That connection has not been confirmed by investigators. She is divorced. Her health has been complicated by long COVID. She is still advocating for the rights of crime victims' families. She is still answering questions about a man she has not spoken to in years and has chosen never to speak to again. She keeps showing up. There is something worth understanding about that, about the difference between surviving something and deciding what to do with the survival. Kerri Rawson did not survive and go quiet. She survived and stayed loud, stayed visible, stayed accountable to people who are somewhere in the early stages of what she has already come through. That is not nothing. Don't summarize a verdict when the verdict is already known. 10 counts, 10 consecutive life sentences, 80 years old in a Kansas correctional facility. The question of what Dennis Rader did was answered in a courtroom in Sedgwick County in June of 2005, and it has stayed answered since. The question that no court closes, the one that Kerri Rawson has been living with for 20 years, is harder. It doesn't begin with what did he do. It begins with who was he to me. And the answer to that question is the one that doesn't resolve, because he was both. He was the man who rushed her to the hospital and the man who put a body in a trunk and handed her the keys. He was the man who cried at the college drop-off and the man whose notebook had her name in it. He was her father. He was BTK. He was both of those things at the same time in the same body for the same 30 years. And no amount of distance, no silence, no cut contact, no correct conclusion she has arrived at erases the fact that she learned to love him first. That is what it costs to grieve someone who is still alive, but was never who you thought they were. You don't mourn the person. You mourn the version of them you needed to be true. If this case made you think, tell me what you think in the comments.